Distinguished guests, please welcome on panel 3, Shrinking Democratic Space, Matthias Beermann, Melanie Sully, Kerem Öktem, Jan Haukas, and the moderator, Hartmut Meyer.
Thank you very much to attend the most difficult session, which is the post-lunch session at every conference. So I'm glad to see so many people here, and I think that is a sign of reward to the excellent panels we had this morning, and we learned a lot already. And what I sometimes find interesting is the things that you learn that you didn't expect. And I learned from a diplomat who was not quite a diplomat that every panelist hates the moderator. So I tried to overcome that burden. And I also understand that Thies, who kindly replaced Dunja, has to leave early. So we want to be very short in order to allow the audience to come back. So I wouldn't talk much other than saying to Sergey, who wanted to discuss interests and not blah, blah, this is probably the session on blah, blah, on values, on human rights, on the freedom of the media. So I apologize to Sergey for doing blah, blah. I have a distinguished panel.
Thank you for this introduction.
And distinguished panel, there's who will go first, Melanie Sully, who had a distinguished career both in academia as well as an advocate, as someone who helps to improve government. She's the head of GO Government, which stands for Good Government, but she was also for many, many years a professor here at the Diplomatic Academy. Also, a variety of careers in one person. This is Thijs Berman, who was a journalist and a correspondent for radio before he became a politician as a member of the European Parliament. Yeah. And after 10 years, going back to media and politics and bridges that world, working for the OSCE in the media office. Then we have someone who studied political science and then went into government and later into the OSCE with distinguished record of a career in the OSCE. This is Jan Haukas, who has been part of concrete missions, and he will speak about what the OECD has done, can do, and probably can do better in the future in these missions. And the last speaker will be Kerem Öktem, who is, we didn't go to school together as some former panelists, but I've known him for 15 years because he was a colleague in Oxford. He's now a professor in Graz and is an expert on Southeastern Europe with a particular emphasis on Turkey, and his talk will be concentrating on Turkey, but it will have wider implications what intergovernmental organization can or cannot do in addressing the problems coming from shrinking democratic space. So, Melanie, you kick us off.
Okay.
Go, Melanie.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And thank you also, obviously, to the students of the Diplomatic Academy. And a big congratulations on organizing this conference. I know it's a lot of work to squeeze in with all the other studies. And thank you to all the sponsors that have given them this opportunity. Well, I wanted to kick off by actually tackling shrinking democratic space because I'm a bit more optimistic. I think we have more democracy than ever before. We have more transparency. We have more NGOs and organizations working on anti-corruption measures, Council of Europe and Greco, etc. And we have a more of an open political culture than ever before. And also much more awareness on a push for gender equality, for the rights of minorities, transgender awareness, and so on. And I think there's also in countries that are facing challenges to this democratic culture, nevertheless, a strong awareness and feeling that they don't want to go back. If you look at Romania recently, where there were challenges to this democratic space, we see people power. We see NGOs and civil society organizing in a way that some years ago would never have been thought so possible. In other countries, like, for example, the United Kingdom, you have electronic petitions where, in a matter of minutes almost, you can have millions signing up, which will force a debate in the House of Commons. So all these things, I think, are very positive, and I think we should be aware of not falling back into kind of gloom and doom. There is more chance for political participation, more consultation in the political process than ever before. The OSCE has a special role. As we all know, it's an organization which stretches from Vladivostok to Vancouver, takes in on the way the United States, where some of you may have some particular concerns, and all these countries it brings together. All the countries in the Caucasus and the Black Sea region are all members, and they've all signed up to the same core principles and are involved in this organization. Now, some of them may flout many of the commitments that they have signed up to, and there will always be such challenges. But I think most of the countries in that organization are very concerned about their image, and therefore they like to get the OSCE on board. They like to be praised for the progress they are making. And I think one important thing is actually to praise where progress is being made and not always point out all the bad things. And also, I think it's very important that we avoid, as very often East of Vienna countries say, a sort of dual morality, where Western traditional democracies are all too keen to point out the deficiencies of others east of Vienna. Well, there's a lot of work to be done in our own democracies, our own mature democracies. And I think where there's an emergency state employed, whether it's in France or for whatever reason, we have to inform the OSCE according to the commitments and continually revise whether that emergency state is still necessary or not. And that will give credibility and inspiration, I think, to other countries that are involved. So I think there's a lot that can be done. My own work, a tiny little bit involved in all this big process in the sphere of soft diplomacy, people up, organizing summer schools with the help of organizations like the City of Vienna International Department around the Black Sea area, conferences, bringing people together from Turkey, from Armenia, from Russia, Georgia, from countries that don't have good relations with each other, but really the young people do, and they can sit around and talk. We've done a lot of that, and you don't see the effects maybe in terms of big politics, but these will be the future generation holders. So I don't know how many more seconds I have.
120.
120, well, that's quite good. Quite a luxury. So just to do a little bit on populism, the rise of populism and so on. I think a lot of that is a problem seen as between them and us, and very often the elites are very cunning in terms of the fact that they present themselves as anti-elitist, although they are part of that establishment and that elite. And I think one reason is that the people, whoever they are, they have a voice. I don't say they don't have a voice, but they don't feel anyone is listening to that voice. And here's where populists come in and give them the impression they are listening and have empathy with people who have concerns and say, I understand what your old problems and I really do sympathize. And actually, they're part of the whole establishment, but it doesn't always become clear. So it's a failing, I think, of conventional politics to listen. We have politicians who talk a lot. We have beautiful presentations of all kinds of conflict resolution. But really, we just need to do it and to listen a lot more than talk.
Thank you so much for starting us on an optimistic note that there's more democracy than ever. There are some studies who say the peak of democracy was in 2006. With all the phenomena that you describe of involvement and so on, there's a bit of a decrease in democracy, and whether we are fighting against those trends, the shrinking dimensions of democracy, and by what tools. Maybe Thies can enlighten us a little bit, because he has been a journalist and a politician, and now he works for the OSCE. Thies, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. What Melanie said is extremely provoking. It's very difficult not to directly engage into a discussion with you. As a politician for 10 years, as a member of the European Parliament, I always felt that part of the mistrust against democratic institutions is due to the very success of democracy of the last 70 years, where we have citizens who are more and more autonomous, better and better informed. They wish to determine their own lives until the last blink of their eyes. And it is more and more difficult to delegate power to politicians who are bound to legislate, to set limits, to create possibilities. There is an inherent tension that is growing between citizens and politicians who take some of their control over their lives away, necessarily, unavoidably. It's not a failure of democracy, it's the success of democracy that creates this tension. And in my view, politicians are very much afraid of all these very autonomous citizens and listen too much and don't dare to say what they really need to say, their own views, but give in too much to groups, to people who rightly and legitimately voice their needs and opinions in order to fail their own re-election. I'm sorry I didn't have to speak about this at all. I needed to speak about the democratic space and journalism and freedom of the media, but it's your fault. It's your fault.
We all need a scapegoat.
We all need a scapegoat.
We all need a scapegoat. That's populism. Yes. That's populism.
It was a way to engage the public with me, okay? So,
but you have something interesting to say about the media and the changing media.
In our office of the representative on freedom of the media, and I stand in for Dunja, and those who know Dunja know that it's a difficult task to try to imitate Dunja. But I'm her principal advisor since September. And I'm a former journalist. I've been a correspondent in Moscow and in Paris and did quite a lot of work as a radio journalist mainly. And then I was this politician for some years. But in our work within the OSCE, we see a kind of a paradox. On the one hand, in the world, I completely agree with Melanie, you see democracy more than, let's say, 20, 30 years ago. Certainly, huge difference. Look at Latin America, where Colombia reached this fantastic agreement with FARC and is going towards peace and going to listen to all these displaced people. I'm not going into detail. Look at Asia, where Burma, yes, they have the Rohingya, and they are discriminating against Muslim people there, and it's very difficult. But on the whole, Burma is on the right path. And in Africa, Gambia, the dictator has been chased away by his neighbors, who said, either you end up in Scheveningen, I know how to pronounce it, I'm Dutch, so, or you leave the door of your presidency as a defeated president. He chose the last option, and rightly so. So on the whole, on many continents, you see a very positive development. Let's see that. And in the OSCE area, the paradox is that we have many countries who are proudly calling themselves illiberal democracies. And even in the Western Europe, and again, I agree with you, Melanie, we have problems realizing that freedom of the media is something to respect. If my country, the Netherlands, introduces a law on the intelligence services, allowing intelligence services to do mass surveillance, including the communication of journalists with their sources, then you attack a very important principle of freedom of the media, and that is the right of journalists to protect their sources. The same law makes an exception for communication between lawyers and their clients. It would have been wise to give the same exception to journalists. It is not in the law. And my parliament in the Netherlands did not see the necessity to do this. So we have our problems, the same similar legislation going on in Germany, UK, etc., etc. We are chasing terrorists, which allows us to put human rights between brackets where we think it's comfortable, convenient, pleasant. Freedom of the media is nevertheless a cornerstone of democracy. So control on the media in countries like Turkey, and many countries in Central Asia, of course. In Russia, it's not so easy to be an independent and oppositional figure in the media. And in Western Europe, you have pluralism under stress. Look at local media in your own neighborhood. I don't know where you're from, but you will see that print media in your regions are dying. And this has huge consequences for democracy on a local level, because critical scrutiny by the media of local government, municipalities, etc., is vanishing. And it's not being replaced by online media. They don't do the same job. This is a difficulty. It's a market failure, you may say, if an objective of our society is to have free and pluralist media doing the proper scrutiny of democratic institutions. I can speak for an hour.
Please don't.
I don't. I don't.
1.5 minutes, maybe?
So from, let's say, a period of idealism after the fall of the wall, and in parallel, idealism about the benefits of internet to democracy, we are going to a growing uneasiness. Let's say internet as a tool for autonomous people is gradually turning into anxiety on Big Brother, following your every step and every click, for commercial reasons or for mass surveillance reasons. They're after you. This is something we try to fight within RFOM, but it's not easy. And intelligence services have very legitimate needs, as we all know. But you should need a dialogue between the media and these services to find out where you can put the limits. Shrinking space, in a certain sense, for many journalists, yes, as they are under attack in many countries. Under attack online with unheard of abuse, in particular against female journalists. Go to the Balkans, go to Turkey. If you are a woman journalist, you are a target. You are aggressed in an incredible way. Very often, of course, sexually. The threats are sexual. I mean, and it works on you. If you get that every day, it works on you. It's not easy to live with. I've had some threats myself as a journalist and later as a politician, but the way women are targeted these days has nothing to do with it. It's 10,000 times more. Journalists are no longer privileged either. 20 years ago, a journalist would be the sort of the privileged transmitter of news. I was in a bombardment in Nagorno-Karabakh of a little town, and the people came to me and said, tell about this, please, you know. Now they would just Twitter or Facebook, and they don't need you any longer, which makes you unprotected. You can also be killed. You're no longer needed. So journalists in war zones run more risks than 30 years ago, in a sense. Because no longer necessary. IS has its own channels to go on internet. No, I just go on. I mean, please, Hartmut, it's okay. It's okay. I can conclude by saying that, never mind all these difficulties, Uzbekistan just freed 2 journalists who had been in prison for over 10 years. And I also think that this movement towards an ever bigger democracy or a bigger space of freedoms against all sort of sensationalist news is not something that can be stopped. More and more people will demand this autonomy and will demand their democracy to live in everywhere in the world. We just have to help with this, and you, as future diplomats, will play an enormous role in this. Yeah.
Thank you. We have more democracy, more levels of engagement. We have, however, also difficult working conditions for journalism. We have repression. We have media use that might disconnect the people from the politicians, and we have organizations that try to respond to these challenges of authoritarian regimes, of repression, of the use of media, and you have had a long experience in the OSCE. So what can the OSCE do? What has it done? What can be done better? And is there hope at the end of your talk?
I hope so. Already there is more enough material here just to continue the discussion on the points that have come, but let me start by wish you all good afternoon. Let me also add my voice to the many who have already congratulated the organizers here with this excellent conference. And I think it speaks volumes both of the quality of the academy and even more so the students of this prestigious institution. The SG set us off this morning, I think, with a very, very good overview of the OSCE, where it came from and how it has developed over the year. I will start very briefly to add a little bit when it comes to my specific area of expertise and work, which is the human dimension of security of the OSCE, which is not that well known outside. I would roughly see the development of the OSCE's human dimension through three main periods of time. First, you had the period from 1975, the Helsinki Final Act, and up to the end of the Cold War, which I would call the Cold War conference years. Although human rights and fundamental freedoms were included already in Helsinki, not much were done in terms of implementing those rights during that time. Then something remarkable happened after the end of the Iron Curtain. In a matter of only 2 years, we had participating states, many of them who had yet even held their first multi-party election in their history, agreed to such landmark documents as the Copenhagen document, establishing that genuine democratic election is the only legitimate form of governance. And not only did they make this as a declaration, but they also specified what constitutes a genuine democratic election. And since then, we in the Office for Democratic Institution and Human Rights, or ODIHR, we have continued to use this document as the benchmark when we go out and observe elections in all the participating states to see indeed how generally democratic they have been. Although the organization or the participating states agreed to establish a number of permanent structure, they could not agree to give this organization either a charter, a court, or the powers of sanction. So it's also important to be aware, for those who may not be so familiar, that these commitments remain political, but not legally binding. But that said, in the period from roughly 1990 to 2005, which I would call the standard-setting years of the OSCE, the states committed themselves to standards unheard of, unknown, even by organizations that are more like-minded than the OSCE is. Around the mid-2005-2006, I could sense that there was a shift, there was a movement within the OSCE. And we entered the stage which I would call the non-consensus years of the OSCE. Increasingly, the relevance of the organization was a matter of discussion, but it was also increasingly difficult to make decisions, whether it be on the budget, let alone new human rights commitments. As a matter of fact, there was increasingly a question about decisions that had already been made, and I'm pretty sure that if you go back to a number of those really standard-setting decisions of the early 90s, if you had brought them back up for debate today, they would not have been adopted. But I don't see this as a return to a Cold War situation, though, in the sense that we are heading towards a situation where you have two major security alliances in a confrontational view. What I do see, though, and that has been increasingly evident, is we have come to a stage of what I would call the tyranny of minority, where you have one or a couple of states that would block the will of the vast majority on, if not all, but most decisions. And these do not need to be the same. But again, it testifies that the national interests have come much more to the fore than it was in the past, especially in the 1990s. And at the same time, we have seen, certainly through our monitoring, that there has been shrinking space, especially for civil society in many of the participating states. And as well as when you, of course, you have politicians who are openly challenging things that they have committed themselves to in the past, starting introducing the concept that somehow the OSCE stands for Western values as compared to so-called traditional values. Of course, this resonates with a broader public in many places. But there's also been an uneven, and I will certainly agree with Melania, and as well as with this, there's not a one-directional development that we have seen. It's been very even. There has been progress and there have been regress in many, many places. But to touch on then very briefly a couple of points of where I would see some of the main trends that have led to where we have challenges in the so-called old or well-established democracies, because we certainly have seen that as well through our monitoring. I will point to four trends and one phenomenon. The first, I think, is distance from conflict. That to some extent, democracy, as it has been understood, has been taken maybe too much for granted. People who have not been exposed to the Cold War, to conflict, or to war in their lifetime are perhaps less likely to appreciate what they were born with. They didn't have to fight for it. Second, declining trust in democratic institutions and low political participation. According to recent Eurobarometer polls, public trust in political parties and the parliament are around 25%, in some countries as low as 10% in the European sphere. And this should certainly be a cause for concern. And to me, this would seem to imply that, that there's a growing perception that parties and parliaments are more bureaucratic rather than political institutions that fail to deliver. This is sort of the "what have you done for me lately" approach that you hear from many voters, very frustrated voters. Then there is a trend in some places towards wishing to have stronger executive powers. It's linked with the first. Again, out of frustration from not seeing real difference between whether you have parties to the left or to the right of the center, there has been a call for a more clear and effective delivery on issues that are topical and touch the emotions of people. Also, the perception of corruption, both economic and moral, and I think here is a very interesting paradox that despite, or maybe even because, our political institutions have become much more transparent than they used to be, there are many more instruments for scrutiny through media, through having access. So I think there is a clash between the perception of the amount of scandal and corruption that was simply not visible in the past, that had been so much more difficult to hide. But nevertheless, it had led to a decrease in trust in this institution, which again is impacting on the level of participation in election for the same. Finally, I think, and I'm sure we will hear more about that, the phenomenon that I think have, if not created these, but certainly amplified all of these four trends. And that's the media revolution that we have seen over the last 25 years. That have completely changed public discourse. 25 years ago, if you represented some marginal or radical opinion, you were unlikely to get your voice heard through any mainstream media. Local newspapers would not publish. You would not be invited to public broadcaster debate shows. And it would be difficult for you to find like-minded. With internet and social media, that has changed completely. Anybody can express, publicize whatever opinion he or she has, and immediately find like-minded, which has both a reinforcing effect on the views you already have, as well as serve as to legitimize those by feeling that you're a member of a community. And this across I'm about to wrap up. I found it striking as a Norwegian myself if you go even to the largest online media in Norway and look at the commentary field, you would sort of get the sense that the country is on the brink of being a failed state, if not already, if you read the commentary that you see there. So So these new technologies has clearly made it both cheaper and more effective than ever to succeed with populist politics, which the essence has always been that you first create an atmosphere of fear or anxiety, then you build a narrative of who are to be blamed, and you present yourself as the only one with a solution to fix it. It's just become much more effective and cheaper. Three very concrete recommendations for how we can approach this through the OSCE and other organizations and as engaged individuals. That we have first and foremost to exit our own like-minded comfort zones and get out there to engage directly, both on and offline. Talking among ourselves or talking to or preaching to the choir, as the says, is not going to change any of that. It's only going to increase the perception among those who are frustrated with the social liberal order. Secondly, political institutions need to get better at communication and adapting to the audience. And third, maybe the most important thing of all, and I'm very pleased that the last few chairmanship, they have put so much emphasis on youth. We need to engage youth in political processes, but in ways that they would find meaningful themselves.
When you said you have hope that at the end there's hope, this was the meaningful engagement of the youth that puts the burden on a lot of people here in the audience to deliver on the hope that you have identified. And you have quite rightly pointed out that the dimensions of the shrinking space for democracy is not a linear process. It's multidimensional, it's multidirectional. More freedom, less freedom, more engagement, less engagement, more diversity, less diversity. And we have a phenomenon that we have these processes as in parallel, and we don't know where we end up. When I observe one particular country, I cannot say it's multi-directional. It seems to go, at least from an outside observer, into one direction, and the shrinking democratic space is a gradual one, but it seems to be shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. But Kerem.
Yes, in fact, it's very one-directional. One of the slogans of the current ruling parties: one leader, one flag, one nation. You can translate that into German, and it sounds really bad. But anyway, I would like
Depends
to...
on who you talk to. You find people in the audience, not here.
Well,
but
we hope not.
In the public that might be more inclined to appreciate that. But
well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the organizers for this amazing conference and for inviting me. And I wish we would have ended with Melanie and with the kind of rather hopeful, inspiring outlook.
She will be back.
And I hope so.
It's a threat.
And not with the gloom and doom scenario to which I will now return. And I think, Melanie, you talked about how kind of member states of the OSCE image is important, which I think ties very much into this whole idea of the power of attraction. You know, why was the OSCE so important just after the end of the Cold War? Because it was, in a way, for a short period of time, the only game in town. Everybody wanted to be democracy. Democracy was the source of legitimate, internationally respected government. And that was a time when I think, you know, Western hegemony was relatively close to kind of be real hegemony, and where it had an impact, and where countries like Turkey or even Russia tried to play according to the rules. And even if they just tried to do it on the surface, it did kind of create some, well, more than rhetorical entrapment for people to kind of confirm. And, you know, this kind of, the idea that you want to be a member in a club of winners, part of the civilized world, the free world, you know, that has a lot to do with Western hegemony, and which, of course, or with Euro-Atlantic hegemony, if you want to call it, and that this is something which is now kind of deeply contested. I'm not going to say that it's gone, but the global power context is a very different one. And you know, the idea that, like the offshoot of modernization theory, that in the end we would all converge on around Western liberal institutions, you know, that was one of the founding ideas of all, you know, NATO, OSCE, Council of Europe, European Union. So as long as there was a clear perspective that one day all of these members would converge on the same liberal democratic principles, that was fine. But now, you know, Fukuyama's end of history is over in a way. The return of geopolitics is with us, as the Secretary General reminded us this morning. and Western hegemony has become contested not only externally but also internally. And I think Professor Voronkov's kind of presentation kind of brought that home very clearly. So we have a problematic situation in institutions like the OSCE or even the Council of Europe, where you have members which are, liberal democracies, of course, many of them in deep crisis, with populist threats on the one side, and then you have full authoritarian regimes. Some of them are competitive authoritarian regimes, some of them are not competitive, and even dictatorships, on the other. So, and without the kind of promise of, a Western hegemonic situation, without the promise of convergence, it's really hard to have both Russia as, well, according to the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons, as a Russia that disregards international human rights standards and wants to undermine the current world order, and the UK, which makes that kind of assessment, which is, despite Brexit, still a liberal country. So, under those conditions, how can you be an effective forum for maintaining security, democracy, and human rights? And I'm not saying that this is not, of course there are pockets, particularly in the Western Balkans, where the OSCE is playing an important role. But, let's take the extreme case, because extreme cases can sometimes help us understand the situation much better, because it puts a particularly sharp light on developments. And the case of Turkey, and it's not just because I happen to be someone who's working on Turkey, but because Turkey is a country that is sort of important and an important part of the world, very deeply intertwined with both European Atlantic structures on the one side and a kind of more historic backdrop of the Middle East and also more recent engagements. Now, when we look at Turkey as a test case of how institutions like the OSCE work or what they could do, we see that what has happened in Turkey is actually, it's an extreme case. It's probably reflective of larger trends, but it's a case where, a few years ago, there was a pluralistic democratic society, and where there's no such thing anymore, despite membership in all of these leading Western institutions, with the exception of the European Union, for which it is, of course, a candidate. I mean, we've seen massive democratic backsliding, authoritarian centralization, and destruction of the freedom of speech, freedom of media. The experts here know that quite well. Increasingly unfair elections, so we're getting towards a terrain where even the very basic kind of requirements of democracy are not being of regarded, and a war in the Kurdish provinces, which is pretty much ignored because it's too tough to handle in a way. And now there is a deeply undemocratic referendum looming on the horizon. And what is a bit shocking is that neither the European Union, nor the Council of Europe, nor the OSCE has been able to have, nor NATO for that matter, had much of an impact. Of course, there are very important statements by Dunja Milatovic on media freedom. The monitoring of elections by ODIHR are incredibly important, because at least in terms of, say, documentation, we know what's been happening before the elections. We know what this kind of whole undemocratic package means, but it had no impact on changing behavior, which, of course, the question is, just documenting is probably not enough if you cannot change the behavior. So why is that? Well, because apparently membership in this club of the OSCE is not attractive to the Turkish government anymore, very different from, let's say, 10 years ago. There is no consequence of ignoring the outcomes. We've also mentioned that there is no way of enforcing, and particularly when you have other member states who don't even pretend to be democratic, like Russia. So in this case, I think Turkey is probably the worst case scenario for what can happen in terms of undemocratic politics. It's quite shocking that it happens while it is a member of all these institutions, and it shows the limits of intergovernmental institutions. So it's a worst case for now, but I think it's certainly not the only one.
Thank you so much, Kerem. And you pointed out there's a limit to what intergovernmental organizations can do. He called for Melanie to come back. Can we, as citizens, as civil society, do more to help the liberal forces in countries such as Turkey and in other spaces that have become more illiberal. Is
Well,
that the hope that you can offer to him who is a bit disappointed about intergovernmental
no
organization?
Hope,
No hope.
no. But, I mean, I do agree with the analysis of you know, brilliantly outlined on Turkey. But where I had a sort of slight problem was the assumption of democracy always coming through as this is Western liberal democracy with its hegemonic position. And I mean, that was equated, as far as I understood, in the way you portrayed it and perhaps the way it was seen in Turkey. And I think that is wrong, and then I think we are doomed to failure if we do that, because obviously that's a rather imperialist touch of democracy that we say, like in Britain, we had democracy for 100 years or more, rules of immunity for 800 years. All we need to do is export that and problem solved. So if we try to then talk about democracy as Western liberal democracy, that, I think, is doomed to failure in a country like Turkey, in a country like Russia, not to mention Asia or elsewhere, because there are different roots and traditions. So we have to have a kind of concept of democracy in which certain basic rules are agreed, as in OSCE principles, but which allow for enough flexibility that they will be relevant. And I think in a lot of the missions I've been on with the OSCE, we often stress, well, look, here are the tools for this, whatever it is, parliamentary codes of conduct. But of course, you have to adapt that to the culture in Georgia or wherever. You just can't parachute it in. And this was the assumption I got from you at the beginning, that it was very much associated with a parachute job, from outside, and therefore an alien force. That is doomed to failure. It's got to have a democratic concept which is going to be flexible enough to be of meaningful relevance to whatever country we're talking about.
It's one of the most difficult ones, between the universalism of liberalism and the cultural relativism, and finding a way of coming to democracy that takes those type of traditions into consideration.
I mean, you could talk
Do you
about
have principles where it stops? Where you say, this is no longer the democracy that I want, even if you vote for it? This is a cultural context, but I'm not accepting
the problem
torture of journalists.
Western liberal democracy has got this rather bourgeois touch about it. That's what I'm saying, an imperialistic touch. And I think he wants to come back, actually. But.
I want to come back to that as well.
Thies first, and then Kerem.
It's a bit as if we are on a crossroads where you see a growing coalition of the unwilling, those who maintain that democracy is not so necessary at all, and that we are very happy with tight control and little freedoms. As if there's another model championed by the Kremlin and in a nice and strange coalition with Saudi Arabia or Turkey, whatever is suitable in different fora. I've been an election observer, a chief election observer for the EU in several countries, Ethiopia, Senegal, Afghanistan, and it's very often the elites in power, the clans in power, who are very happy to propose you this different option. We have different visions on democracy, blah, blah, blah. It's to keep their privileges. If you speak with people, with voters actually, who stand in long lines, certainly in Ethiopia, under the heat, under the sun, to vote, and who hope that this vote will be taken seriously, these people genuinely want a government that they choose. And Melanie is completely right in saying that you need to respect cultural traditions, and there are so many different democratic ways possible. Look only within Europe, the very different forms democracy can take, from Britain, where winner takes all, to my country, the Netherlands, complete proportional system on all levels. There is not one model for democracy, even within Europe. But what we do know is that it's one universal human right. People have the right to choose their government freely. And that is something you cannot negotiate. And I'm afraid that Turkey today is the most powerful country in Europe because it has the migration deal. And it is, fear, of course, is the most important emotion of diplomats, but it's now also the most important emotion of many governments who think that their survival depends on this deal on migration, which is wrong. And I don't think you do the Turkish people a big favor by keeping silent, as we do, towards what is happening in Turkey today, with over 150 journalists in prison and tens of thousands, of course, of other citizens in big difficulty. And it is unacceptable for any country in the Council of Europe or any country pretending to accede to the European Union in the future.
Different paths towards democracy, varieties of democracy, but you say the people should choose the government they want. We have seen it in Washington, and we are still not happy with the government that the people wanted, and we seem to have principles to say, well, this is a bit too much of going with the perceived will of the people, and there's an institutional framework which constrains the will of the people, and we consider that to be legitimate. Going back to Turkey, where is the boundary between the will of the people, the suppression of the people, liberal democracy, without going back to outside imposition of a Western model, of a colonial model, and so on? Where do you see
Well, I mean, maybe
the
before
alternative?
answering that question, I'd first like to kind of respond briefly to Melanie, because it's the first time that I've been kind of criticized as being sort of neo-colonial in my argument, which I
was not
can
a
It's the
agree.
first
I'm
time
not-
for everything, I guess.
There's always a first.
Yeah.
But I mean, what I was trying to say is that there was a much stronger kind of pro-kind of democracy discourse and movement, which had a lot to do with a certain model of development being hegemonic in the world, or being considered as hegemonic. And that kind of created a lot of dynamics in a lot of countries. It forced a lot of political elites in non-democratic countries to kind of conform in one way or the other to kind of the basic idea of democracy, which was a good thing. I'm not saying that Western hegemony was always a good thing, but that was a moment where things could have gone differently. And in the case of Turkey, and more generally, I mean, cultural specificity is important, but it's also, and Hartmut also mentioned the issue, this, whether it's about universal values, and cultural specificity is important, but it can easily go into cultural relativism. And in the case of Turkey and every member of the Council of Europe, it's clear what kind of a democracy or a liberal democracy is, in fact. I mean, members of the Council of Europe, at least in theory, have signed up to a liberal understanding of democracy. It's not only about elections or about, it's about deep kind of minority rights. It's quite a sophisticated liberal deal. So in that case, Turkey, like many other members of the Council of Europe, are part of that deal. And well, obviously, now they're not. And now the question is, this big story about the popular will and, how much, where does democracy end and where does kind of veto powers and kind of even tutelage democracy start? I mean, those are questions which in the study of Turkey we've been asking ourselves quite a lot, about the deep state and, all the veto players, the military, the courts, to what extent do they kind of limit the power of the executive? And we're seeing, interestingly enough, the same questions being asked in the United States now. And I hear it even from convicted Democrats, like the calls for these veto powers to kind of come back and save, the basics of democracy. And I think it's this, you cannot have kind of the will of the people being implemented without any kind of constitutional and other veto powers. Because then it becomes something very different. It becomes a majoritarian system, which then looks much more like the competitive authoritarian systems we have also in the OSCE and the Council of Europe.
Let me be authoritarian and give the voice to the people, because Thies has to leave us in 10 minutes, and I want to invite questions from the floor and give him the opportunity to respond, in particular to questions which cover his area, media freedom, but also maybe drawn as expertise as a politician. So I give the voice to the people. Unless you're from CNN, I say not you, you are fake news. But we have someone in the front row here first. And please introduce yourself, your association, and direct the question to a particular member of the panel or to all.
Thank you, and a terrific panel. So I'll direct this to Mr. Berman, just since you're
Can you
gonna
tell us
head
who
out,
you are and
yes,
why?
Yes, sure.
And why? Why you are?
Richard Harknett. I'm a Fulbright professor currently in the Cyber Studies program at Oxford and a longtime lecturer here at the DA.
Right.
So I wanted to pick up on this thesis about the empowerment of the individual. You suggested that this is one of the successes of democracy, right, is that we have this autonomous individual emerging, right? Mm-hmm. And then if we recognize that this is only getting amplified by information technology,
Yes.
right? So Orwell got it wrong, right? We're in a world of Orwell in reverse, right? The individual has gained relative to the state as much as the state has been able to leverage the technology. So where in that world does legitimacy come from? Right?
Oh, very good. Yeah.
So,
I think I collect.
Oh, yeah.
And then
What
where does legitimacy come from?
From genuine dialogue with your citizens.
We have one there. If you, yes. And then we take a third, and I have seen you. You come in the next round. Okay.
Hello, my name is Daniel Rothlin. I'm a student here at the Academy. And to Mr. Haukas, you mentioned that it's important to engage in a meaningful dialogue with the youth. And how do you approach a youth and explain concepts like democracy or media or politics to a youth that's used to consume youth via Instagram or Snapchat?
Okay. And then the lady here in the third row. And then I'll put it back to the panel.
Hello, Deniz Hançer from the Turkish Permanent Mission to the OSCE. I would like to thank all the panelists, and almost all of the panelists finger pointed to Turkey, and I feel obliged to take the floor and make some comments and shed light on the situation in Turkey and to answer the allegations.
This is a question.
It's also a question. In the end, there will be a question, be sure.
But it should be a question, and it should be brief rather than a defense.
It is brief. It's the freedom of expression, huh?
Okay, it is.
Okay. So over the last years, Turkey has been facing various terrorist threats, and Mr. Öktem called that Turkey is the worst case scenario. So what is worst case is what happened in Turkey in last summer. So imagine that your parliament and the office of the president has been bombed by F-16 warplanes, and tanks opened fire to your own people. We always appreciate the constructive criticism, and we developed a robust cooperation with the offices of with the institutions of the OSCE and also the Council of Europe. But Turkish state has the right and responsibility to take the necessary measures to completely eliminate these threats posed to our democracy. And there are judicial remedies, also domestic remedies for who feel that they are not allegedly falsely had put to prison, and also I would like to ask another thing. The freedom of expression we are talking about. Our ministers were denied to make speeches in some European capitals, and so Europe always talks about, we always talk about the freedom of expression, freedom of media, but our democratically elected representatives, they do not tolerate their speech. So is that a contradiction, do you think? Thank you.
Thank you. Legitimacy.
I think your question on the legitimacy of democratically elected people in power is completely justified. I am afraid that with this autonomous citizen we have, you also need to innovate in democracy. And that the democratic cultures of many countries have a slower evolution than the minds of their people. Look at a country that is relatively top-down like France, still very centralist, even though there has been some decentralization. many citizens are extremely fed up with Paris deciding so much. And if you take this autonomy of well-informed citizens seriously, then you innovate and you no longer develop blueprints that are just to be executed, implemented in the field, but you develop the blueprint with concerned citizens. And this is very well possible, even in large projects. I will not dive into it too much, but innovation of democracy is more urgent than ever to keep this legitimacy of democratic institutions. On Turkey, if you allow me, there is no country in the world at this moment that is struck so often by terrorist attacks. And it is it's disastrous the way the Turkish people are being struck by terrorist attacks in Istanbul, in Ankara, and in other places, many other places. The coup d'etat has been condemned by the whole world, and repeatedly so. And our representative on freedom of the media in every statement on the situation in Turkey repeats this condemnation, of course, of the coup d'etat. It has become a kind of a ritual. Nevertheless, so many months after the coup d'etat, this cannot be an excuse to put in prison journalists who do nothing else than their work writing about opposition figures. One journalist of Die Welt who is now arrested for an interview he did in 2015 with a PKK leader. Now, all of a sudden, there are no excuses for this kind of arrests. And the judiciary redress of this is very complicated, as they have little access to lawyers unless in the presence of police officers. It is very difficult for them to work with lawyers as long as they have no indictments. And in many cases, there are no indictments. There are just rumors in the press and accusations that they are terrorists or helping terrorists. If you report on a terrorist, you are not a terrorist, you are a journalist. And this is a distinction that the Turkish authorities should make, and that is what the representative on freedom of the media repeatedly tries to tell. And you know the intense dialogue that the representative has installed with Turkey in all respect of the Turkish people and the Turkish government. But it's not easy, this dialogue, when the basic principles of the Council of Europe are in difficulty, and such a difficulty in the country itself. And we regret this enormously, and we are ready to assist, of course, Turkey in its very difficult situation it is today.
I suggest that we stay on the Turkish issue, and you might want to respond, and then we come back to how do you engage youth, because it follows directly, and the question was directly addressed.
I mean, Thijs has already, I think, said the most important words, but I'd like to thank the lady from the representation to the OSCE. I mean, of course, you said Turkey has the right to eliminate threats. The whole question is about to threats of the system, how it goes about when it eliminates those threats. And the word elimination is, of course, a bit problematic here because it brings to mind kind of rather drastic measures, and those are exactly the measures which we're seeing now. And it's not only journalists who are in jail, but thousands of academics who've lost their positions. And as an academic, of course, I feel particularly close to that because I have a lot of colleagues, who are leading academic personalities in the field, international professors who've lost their jobs because they've signed a petition which called for peace because they've made a stance against the government. So, the elimination process can in no way be justified by what happened on the 15th of July, which was, of course, a terrible coup attempt. And we know very little about it and what happened about it. And, we hope to know more how this was possible and under what conditions and who were the real responsibles. And I think that will be an important issue for Turkey to come in the future as well. But when it comes to the question about the contradiction in terms of freedom of speech, I mean, that's always a justified question, because freedom of speech is often seen as a major kind of public good in Western democracies, but then there are all these exceptions where, of course, freedom of speech doesn't apply, for instance, in the case of Holocaust denial. But I can obviously not talk on behalf of the German government, for instance, and it was not the government really, but like the mayor of the local city where this minister was barred from speaking. But I can only kind of refer to Cem Özdemir's statement on this, who basically said, you know, the reason we want actually also representatives of the AKP to campaign on behalf of the referendum in Turkey, but only if the other side can also be allowed in, and that's why they should send like the chairman of the pro-Kurdish party, the HDP party, Selahattin Demirtas, who is now in jail. So that's Cem Özdemir's idea, and I think it's not a bad one, actually.
We have to say thank you to Thies, who has to leave us, but you made an enormous contribution, and you were at least as good as Dunja could have been. And thank you for your wonderful contribution, and send her our best regards, and thanks for joining us.
You'll see, Dunja would have been much more diplomatic than I am, but I'll make it up with Turkey later. Have a good coffee. Have a good coffee together.
Thank you so much, Thies.
Yes.
No, we are not. This is not the end of the panel.
Don't go.
This is the applause for Jan's program on how to engage the youth. Jan.
I will get to that, but I just want to have a very, very short comment to sort of the general, because the discussion now has been about what is really central also in the OSCE, security versus democracy and human rights, and what is the balance. As far as we are concerned in ODIHR, we base our work on the decision that the states made themselves in 1991, that there can be no lasting security and stability without full implementation of the OSCE's human dimension commitments. That's the basis for our work. This is what we believe in. I personally very much believe that you can never become less stable by implementing too many human dimension commitments. It's more a question about, but there's pretty good evidence that any curtailing of fundamental freedoms and human rights is certainly not going to lead to long-lasting stability or security for the country. But to the question on how we can engage with youth and the era of Snapchat and what have you, I think that maybe is a part of the answer in itself. That we have to, as mentioned in the beginning, we have to find ways, we have to adapt to how youth are communicating, how youth are perceiving themselves in society. We have to engage them on their terms, not on the terms of previous generations. We try to do that in ODIHR in a number of ways. First and foremost through a very extensive network of civil society organization, because not all youth are only sitting in front of the computer or on Facebook. There's a lot of engagement out there, and many of them, they do indeed volunteer, do all sorts of work through civil society. Secondly, youth parties is essential. We have had programs for many years trying to strengthen engagement through youth parties. So also youth party can serve as to challenge sort of their mother parties by bringing in young, new ideas, ways of thinking, as well as making sure that the mother parties would know how actually to address the needs and the interest of youth through their campaigning. So that should be a win-win. Last but not least, we also have some very specific project. We have a young policy advisor network, where we are building capacity of young policy advisors who are then later going into public administration, so that they can have a good international experience and therefore also strengthening reforms in there. Last but not least, we have had quite a successful program on the Western Balkans, particularly addressing the needs of the Roma and Sinti community, recognizing that it was difficult actually to identify good advocates from within the community. We spent time and resources in developing capacity of a number of really brilliant members of that community who have later taken that on and become agents for change for their own community and their own generation. It's possible.
Melanie wants to come in.
Yeah, well, I think on youth are pretty much engaged in many ways and very politically interested and active in a certain segment. That is the educated youth, that we found that in polling, in elections, in referenda. Youth that have had sort of university education, have taken advantage of Erasmus programs or such things, they are certainly engaged. The problem is targeting youth that don't have the benefits of such education, who don't have job perspectives and feel completely alienated from the system. And I think we have to do more on getting them involved in having a stake in society. And I think also youth engagement is not something you get when you're like 18 or 16 or whatever. It should be right from the beginning in civic education in schools, but also in participatory schemes in schools, that you have a share in the democratic running of that school, not taking the big decisions on hiring or firing, head teachers or whatever, but on actually managing the day-to-day things that would be influencing their lives or having some say, in fact, and then learning that having the tools of participation is a natural thing. Most sort of kids should be learning some kind of participation at home in the family, but it may well be that the family is rather hierarchical and kids are told, just shut up and do what you're told because it's easier for parents. But if you go to school, that should not be the kind of culture. It should be a participatory culture, and then it becomes much more natural in the political process.
In the UK, relationship education, sexuality education starts at the age of 4. Would you suggest citizenship, democracy education should also start?
No, it's an ongoing process.
An ongoing process, and gradually for the particular age and appropriate how to engage. Is that the type of program we should target them earlier?
Well, yes, if you remember in Austria, people can vote at the age of 16. So we have to start a lot earlier than we have been starting for this. But I mean, the earlier, the better, that people realize they can have a say, but also that they can change things. I mean, earlier was said, the big thing is to choose your government. But when a lot of young people feel that doesn't do anything, you go and vote, but what for? Nothing changes. So what's the point is what you often hear. So you have to have a meaningful participatory democracy in which something does change and where people feel that there is some point going to vote.
The gentleman in that row has been raising his arm for quite some time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, when we started
if
the
you
panel...
would like to introduce yourself.
Okay, sorry. Tavan Pogosan, a member of Armenian Parliament. When we started this panel, you make a very interesting statement, so that speakers hate moderator. I think sometimes participants also, because my question was particularly for Mr. Berman. But in any way, let me ask the question then to Madam Melanie Sully. You talk about the youth engagement and early need for education, and education on democracy, and then they also need to participate as a future decision makers. They need to be not deprived of the at least participatory possibilities in knowledge obtaining as well as on value discussions. As you know, we've been discussing today many issues about OSCE and the conflicts. In your programs, do you have also engagement of the youth from the conflicting territories, which are unrecognized and that's why deprived of being able to participate? How are you dealing with these issues at all, if you are able to engage them, or let's deprive them, they are not really the ones who are sharing the values, or not the one who have been deserving for at least participation in their youth time? Thank you.
The gentleman in the... Yep.
I understood from the gentleman who just left that the OSCE has spoken up repeatedly on Turkey. My question is concerning the disconcerting development in Hungary in the media landscape. Has the OSCE spoken up, and what has been the reaction from the Hungarian side?
Thank you. I'm happy to take a third in this. Yeah, the lady.
I'm not with CNN, but with the Austrian press agency. My name is Catherine Lankes.
You are fake news.
I hope I'm not. My question would also have been directed to Mr. Berman, but it's also interesting for the whole panel, I guess. Having said what has been said, wouldn't especially the position of Dunja Mijatovic be one of the prime agendas now to replace? And how would you say to succeed if, or proceed if succession for Dunja Mijatovic cannot be found in the next months?
We have one specific question on programs engaging the youth in conflict areas, one on Hungary. Do you want to start on the programs because you're representing the institution?
I'll try. I mean, there are, in the end of the day, of course, the OSCE is an intergovernmental organization, and it's important to be aware of that. And even if we have an autonomous mandate, but it is to assist participating states, the governmental side, in implementing their human dimension commitments, as well as holding them to account when we believe that there's a lack of political will to implement them. But I'll give you one concrete example of. Let me restart there. For the particularly conflict zones, or considered to be as such in the OSCE, there are specific mechanisms that have been set up over the years that have a mandate to deal particularly with that. So while we don't, as ODIHR, we don't engage when it comes to conflict zones as such, we do of course recognize that all citizens in the whole OSCE region are citizens of the OSCE. So when we, every year when we're organizing our Human Dimension implementation meeting in Warsaw, it's free for any person to register and participate on equal footing with other representatives of civil society as well as with the delegations who are there. So there are a number of different mechanisms how this is being dealt with. Although I can't speak on behalf of RFWM, but when it comes to the question on Hungary, we have very good engagement with them. We have publicly expressed concern when we believe there have been reason to do so. But again, as an intergovernmental organization, and maybe that was also what the Secretary General was alluding to this morning, sometimes the greatest successes are the ones that nobody ever hears about. So often we have been able to impact change by not choosing to go to the public first, but we would send, let's say, a letter to the authorities requesting specific information and clarification, and already there setting in motion a process where I'm not only talking about Hungary, but many participating states recognizing that it's better to work with us in addressing our concern, perhaps without the media visibility to that. So I do believe we have managed to contribute to resolve what could have become very problematic laws or amendments to laws in many participating states by engaging also through the quiet diplomacy that particularly the High Commissioner is not only famous for, but also has part of the mandate.
Have you got replies to your letters?
Yes, we are always getting responses to our letters, but I can't comment on the content of the diplomatic correspondence.
Yeah, I think you have a problem in such cases where there's one side that just don't respect the rules of the game or the OSCE commitments or whatever those are. How do you engage with them? Because very often they will be engaged in violence and the other side will see them as terrorists. Do you do business with them? I mean, this was the problem in Northern Ireland with the IRA. Actually, the British government didn't want to be seen pictured with members of the IRA who were blowing up targets on the mainland. Do you engage with them, or do you try to use other methods? And I think in the end, you do engage, and negotiations are very difficult. But you have to get to the heart of the matter. But sometimes those divides are so big because there's a very strong culture of opposition. And Tony Blair, when he was writing this autobiography, said that as soon as one side, say, had good relations with Palestine, the other side would immediately have good relations with Israel, not because it was rational or anything, but just because it was opposed. And when you've got those sides so far apart, conflict resolution is a huge challenge, I think.
You wanted to respond to it?
Yes, on the question of succession to Dunja Matovic, we are in a very special situation now in the OSCE that all 4 heads of secretariat and institutions are up at the same time. That has never been the case before. Both the challenge and opportunity of the OSCE as a consensus-based organization without a charter is that they can decide on everything or nothing. In other words, they are not bound by rules. Whatever all 57 agree to, that is their sovereign decision to make. So, for instance, in the case of Dunja Mijatovic, when the states fail to gather consensus of her successor when her second 3-year mandate expired a year ago, then they turn it around and agreed to prolong it with 1 year, which has never happened before in the OSCE. So that speaks both of the flexibility, but also of the difficulty in the OSCE decision making. But the simple answer to your question is that if they don't agree to either a prolongation or the appointment of a new, there simply will not be a representative of freedom of media till they do. Just as the High Commissioner for National Minorities, they have been without a High Commissioner since, I believe, August last year, because of the failure of the states to agree on a replacement for Astrid Thors.
We have 3 minutes and 3 speakers. If our maths are right, it's 1 minute each on the question. We have covered a lot of ground in that shrinking space. We have seen the battle of narratives. Someone's journalist is another one's terrorists. You restrict my freedom of speech, but you claim freedom of speech, and who can restrict what on what grounds? Will we continue with this battle, or will we have an expansion of democratic space within the area that the OSCE covers? Will the OSCE make a positive contribution to this space, or is the answer it depends which country, which area, what kind of policy we see? I think we go in reverse order, start with Kerem, then we have Jan, and we started with hope, we might end up with hope.
I think it depends very much on the country and also on the general context. I mean, as we've discussed before, the OSCE doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates in a world of power plays, of power dynamics, and maybe now are not the best of times, and it's not that easy to see how this world will look like 5 or 10 years from now, which is a new and unexpected situation. So I wouldn't want to kind of speculate too much, but I think where probably the OSCE can ask itself, you know, why there have been certain more successful steps in certain areas and less successful ones in others. I mean, the issue of Roma, for instance, Roma and Sinti has been mentioned. There, for instance, there's been pretty much, I know that this is contested and not everybody would agree, but overall recent studies suggest that there has been no progress at all in terms of marginalization of Roma communities. I mean, what many of the Council of Europe and OSCE programs have done was to create a kind of Roma and Sinti elite, which has been very good in kind of, you know, taking up the cream, but very little of this has kind of helped to empower Roma communities. That's just one of the examples where I think it's worth looking into, you know, where the OSCE has its best practices on which it can be proud, and where, you know, certain things haven't gone that well.
Jan.
We have to comment on the last thing there. Indeed, there is lots more to be done, especially when it comes to working to help the Roma Sinti community across Europe. I would not agree, though, that we haven't been able to make an impact, even if as the first international organization that actually had a dedicated Roma and Sinti portfolio, we have 3 staff dealing with the whole OSCE area, so there's also a matter of resources. But I think, again, the places where it is maybe not so well registered is that we have been able to address, for instance, the equal access to quality education for Roma and Sinti children in a couple of OSCE participating states where that was not the case before. So some tangible, but we are talking about whole generation here, how to address so that we don't see yet another generational reproduction of inequality of Europe's largest minority without a kin state on the continent. I think you alluded to in the beginning, OSCE clearly has to do better, as we all have. I think where we need to refocus is to ensure much better coordination with other international bodies. There has been too much of, on the one hand, competition between different institutions, organizations trying to attract funding and what have you, also leading to a certain level of forum shopping from some states. Better coordination, I always use the example, all EU member states are members of the Council of Europe, all Council of Europe member states are OSCE participating states. We have a duty also to our own citizens, our own taxpayers, so that the public money that goes to funding goes to where it can add the most value. So there is clearly much more to be done. Finally, speaking as a representative of ODIHR and going back to something that Melanie mentioned before, we are working on I think there are many who are trying to create the perception of that, yeah, nobody is perfect, and I hear that more and more often. From our point of view, we would certainly would agree, nobody is perfect, but that doesn't mean that we are all equally imperfect. And we have clear benchmark for that by the decisions. It's not about ODIHR telling states what they should do. We are reminding them constantly about what they declare that they would be doing themselves. And it's not so difficult to identify where there are shortcomings and what the reasons are for that. And in most cases, that is lack of political will by those in charge. Thank you.
Melanie.
Well, I think many generations recently had always the feeling that they were moving forward, in fact, that their living standards were getting better steadily. And this has not been the case in the last 10 years since the financial crisis, 2007, 2008. And so therefore people are economically stagnating or worried in many countries that there is no improvement. And I think this is the biggest challenge to democracy, in a sense that there's a growing cleavage between the rich and the poor, at least a perceived cleavage, and that is an economic challenge to democracy, but not a political one that we've been discussing in this panel.
So let me thank the panel once again, and let us remind ourselves about the deep security and the comprehensive security that the OSCE helps providing. And Sergei said we want to talk about interests and not blah blah, but I think comprehensive security means hard security, boom boom, and soft security, blah blah. And I think we need to combine boom boom and blah blah. And I think the panel has done it. So thank you very much.
I totally disagree with Hartmut Meyer in one thing, and I believe in this case I can speak for all of us. This panel was certainly not a blah blah panel. There seems to be more democracy than ever before in general, but especially within the OSCE region we experience an adverse trend in some spaces. Thank you all for your valuable and especially straightforward contributions. I think one other round of applause for this panel.